first guard in Bolognese Sword and Buckler is known as Gurdia Alta, or the high guard. This can be done with either foot in front, in a narrow stance, or in a wide stance. The default is a narrow stance with the sword foot forward. The buckler is fully extended at shoulder height. Most of your defense in this guard is going to come from the buckler. Bolognese says that most of the time you can simply beat it up and down in order to parry. You also may need to go side to side slightly, but not very far. Your parries are done with the edges of the buckler for any high attacks or any attacks to the sides. For low attacks, you'll tend to use more of the face of the buckler and the boss in a smothering type action. The sword hand is held high and slightly forward with the tip up or slightly back. Quillions can be pointed forward or they can go sideways. The illustrations show both with no notation on preference. The illustrations are from Marazzo, by the way. The text we're using is from Bolognese. From here, most of your attacks are going to be quick wrist cuts on either side, and they can be downwards or rising, depending on what happens to be available to you. You're going to try to avoid big cuts from here because it'll expose your forearm to a quick counterattack, known as a stop cut or stop thrust. While in this guard, you can easily transition to a point forward position in order to thrust high as well. This guard does have one major weakness that is really easy to exploit, and that is it exposes the hand and forearm to your opponent. Now the hand doesn't look like it's too exposed in this guard, but that's because this is a rapier guard. If this was a proper side sword, then it wouldn't have the side rings, it might not have a knuckle bow, and it may or may not have the finger rings. In the event that your opponent is using a rapier, as I am now, that simply means your target area becomes the wrist and forearm rather than the fingers. The technique otherwise works the same. So, seeing your opponent in Alta, you cut a mandrito, which is any onside attack, in this case probably a mandrito squalembrato or diagonal cut, to the hand or wrist. You immediately follow this up with a reverso, again to the hand or wrist. Your third attack involves dropping the point down, pulling the hand high, and then cutting upwards in what's known as a montante. Again, to the hand or wrist. Now there is some debate about the exact definition of a montante. Depending on who you ask, it can either be a true edge cut thrown in the manner of a falso, or an actual falso with the false edge. For this particular technique, I find using the true or bottom edge of the sword to be more effective. Now, Bolognese doesn't say what to do with your feet. So it's up to the fencer to decide if he wants to take steps when performing this technique. Generally that will depend on how close your opponent is and what he's doing. If he's just standing there and you get into range with your first cut and step, then the second and third don't need additional steps. If on the other hand he's moving away from you, then you'll need to do take additional steps with your second and third cut. If he's moving towards you, you can back away, you can move to either side, or you can change the play slightly. So, after the first two cuts, you can step forward, pushing the buckler against his forearm, preventing him from lowering it, which will allow you to do your montante against his chest or face, ending in a position for a quick thrust, also to the face. And this brings us to the theory of the technique. According to Monsiolino, this works because as you're cutting at your opponent's hand, he will be too fearful to lower it from the Gurdia Alta position for fear of being cut. Now in practice, we find that we tend to lower it a bit faster when someone's cutting our hand because we want to catch their hand cut against our forte. Nonetheless, the technique still works, especially with the closing action and the final montante going across the chest into the face thrust. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the thrust to the face is something that we added ourselves through experimentation. Monsiolino doesn't actually mention what comes next after the third cut. Presumably, your opponent's dropped his sword because he's lost his fingers, or at least the tendons in his fingers, and can no longer hold it. But since that's not a guarantee, we always look for something extra to do, our next available move, after performing each play. Another option, after you perform the 3 cuts to the hand, is to simply return back up to Alta and begin the next technique.